Hey guys, welcome to my home. I forgot I told you I was going to finish up this chapter with a video, so this is the video. Just to recap real quickly, we were talking about Freud and Freud's sort of emergence on the scene and his, excuse me while I allow my dog in, 1 second. Hello, hello, do you want to say hi to my class? Come here, come here, come here. Oh, say hi to my class. Hey everybody, I'm Lola. I'm the one the band was named after. Okay, I'm sorry. Sorry guys. Okay, that's Lola. My band is called the Freakin' Lolas, by the way, because she freaks out when the doorbell rings. Hopefully that won't happen while we're recording. Yes, I know, girl. All right, so Freud bursts on the scene, introduces the issue of clinical psychology, but fundamentally changes what the scientific psychologists thought they were building. And so we mentioned there was a bit of a reaction that in Europe they kind of retreated back to studying perception. And a different group really kind of started talking about humanistic psychology. So that'll come in all through. And I told you that in the Americas, it was much more of behaviorism that kind of took over. Yes, Pavlov, the Russian, kind of led the way, I guess, by his example. But it was really John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner that they kind of defined behaviorism and made it extremely popular through really from the 1930s into the 1960s. But we had gotten somewhere around here that around the 1960s, some things happened. So first of all, I should say that behaviorism and the insistence that it not focus on memory or consciousness or attention or any of those things was pretty limiting to psychologists. You could learn a lot by studying stimuli and responses, but there was getting to the point where a lot of the research that was obvious, they kind of did. And so there was this desire to once again broaden psychology. And so I just imagined that there were also influences from the military where they were interested in how processes like attention worked. So they were kind of pushing and fueling through grant money research that did focus on things like attention. And I also mentioned that the computer, the existence, the creation of the computer, really provided a model. And I answered a question after class, and I think I want to talk about this really quickly. When you think about people studying the atom, they would use the solar system as a kind of analogy. And they would, from what they knew about the solar system, they thought, well, maybe the atom is kind of like that. That's what the computer did for internal processes, cognitive processes for humans. The computer was kind of like a human. It took input, it processed it, it produced output, but it did so in ways we understood, very concrete ways. So things like memory systems suddenly stopped being vague and started being things we built and stored. And so we had algorithms to put things in memory and to pull them out. And so suddenly a lot of the mysticism and I don't even know what the right word is, but when people talk about memory or attention or consciousness, it used to seem kind of squishy. But once the computer existed, we started to understand concrete ways of thinking about these things. And so, like the solar system inspired work on the atom, the computer kind of became a model that psychologists started to apply to ourselves, to human beings, that maybe we are kind of like computers. Now, you'll find out that over time we think we kind of are and we're kind of not. So we've kind of made those distinctions. But the birth of the computer was really critical for getting people to be able to go back into sort of internal mental processes. And I also we ended the class talking about this invisible animal entering the class and yada yada. Again, the critical point with respect to the invisible animal was that there started to be this argument. So behaviorists said you can only scientifically study what you can directly see and measure. But people started to say, I don't know, that's not really true. Sometimes we use electron microscopes to learn about things based on the traces they leave, for example. And similarly, we could learn about mental processes by looking at the influences they have on behavior or whatnot. So just because you can't see something doesn't mean you can't learn about it. And so, that was just sort of a view that was in the air. And so people started to study cognitive processes, memory, attention, consciousness, etc., using very clever experiments. And you're going to learn a lot about these experiments. So the idea was if you set up an experiment right, you can see the effects these things are having, and then you can learn about the sorts of processes that would produce that effect. I know, a little vague now, but the important point here from the history of psychology is that in the 60s and 70s, things started to change, and we suddenly started to get reinterested in a lot of cognitive processes. Now, other things started to emerge then too. The field of social psychology. Social psychology is really the study of sort of the impact that other people and places or contexts have on us. So things like prejudice, why are certain people react in certain prejudicial ways towards others, or what does it feel like to receive prejudice? Questions like what does the media do? How does it affect, for example, perceptions of what we mean by beautiful? How does it enforce stereotypes, leading to things like prejudice, etc.? So media influences, peer pressure. How does your peer group affect you and your influences? And things like violence. How do gangs form? Why do people ever join them in the first place, etc., etc.? So social psychology is all about this sort of people effects, people on people, and things like that. That started to become strong and remains a very strong area of psychology. Okay. And of course, something really important within the last 10 to 20 years is that the tools we have for measuring the brain, or not just the brain. So, for example, this is an EEG, measures electrical activity in the brain. That can tell you some things about what's going on within the brain. We'll talk about EEG studies. This is an eye tracker. This little device can tell us exactly what this person is looking at as she explores the world or does whatever. And to some extent, what you're looking at tends to correlate with what you're thinking about. So the eyes are sort of a gateway to the mind. And so we can use things like eye trackers to learn about thought and cognition and interactions. And of course, brain scanning technology, from CATs first to MRIs, fMRIs, SPECT. We have all these tools now. And in some cases, we can actually watch the brain in action. And we can see what parts of the brain seem to be active while a participant does various tasks. And so this has suddenly, literally, I said the computer allowed us to start thinking about things because we could understand, how a memory system might work. Well, now we can kind of watch it. We can kind of see what the brain is doing and follow blood flowing through the brain. And therefore, we can now, really study the mind and brain and how they're connected. And so this has ushered in, neuroscience as being really strong. And in fact, in areas like cognitive psychology now, there are no real cognitive psychologists. There are cognitive neuroscientists, and there are social neuroscientists. And just about every area of psychology now, if you're studying prejudice, that's cool, but what parts of the brain are relevant? So we almost always connect what we're studying to brain areas, brain regions, brain processing, thanks to our ability to measure the brain so well. Okay. I also want to point out, I kind of talked about, the scientists and then Freud being non-scientific. And I also mentioned in class how for many years, clinicians didn't seem to worry too much about, verifying their things using scientific methods or whatnot. But that, those two paths that diverged have largely converged again. So now a lot of clinical research is scientifically based and is scientifically verified. And in fact, it's because of this that we have now a clinical program here at UTSC, the only one at U of T. U of T didn't used to want one because it was not scientific. But given how much science has invaded the clinical practice and kind of helped us, do things in an evidence-based way, we are now, more comfortable with clinical psychology to the point where we have one of the newest clinical psychology programs in Canada. So yeah, those two things have kind of come together. Okay, so this is sort of where we are now. As you'll see as we go through the course, psychology has become a very wide science. It covers all sorts of things, from the biological to things as personal as sexual behavior, as I say, to things as social as prejudice, as clinical as psychopathology. It is about all of human behavior and trying to understand it from a number of different perspectives. Human behavior is extremely complex. It's determined by all sorts of things, but we're getting better and better tools, and we have very clever experiments, and we're starting to understand better and better how things are working. So it's young, it's a young field, full of promise. Some of you guys may literally be the ones that produce the next major breakthroughs in the field. Unlike physics and chemistry, which are pretty mature, we're still getting there. We're still figuring out our methods. We're still learning more and more all the time. So it's kind of a fun area that way. It's a nice young science with new things all the time. Very cool. So that's where we are. As we go forward, the next thing we're going to do is talk about the scientific method. So I want you to really understand how we learn things in psychology. And from there on, we'll start talking about specific issues, sensation, perception, memory, etc., as we go. All right, so that's it for chapter 1. Starting Friday morning, we'll be into chapter 2. All righty, talk to you later. Bye-bye.